Look, I'm just gonna come right out and say it. I was not looking forward to your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. While it's certainly true that X-Men 97 raised the bar for what to expect from Marvel animation, there have just been too many red flags to ignore with this show. What had initially been announced as an origin story for Tom Holland's Spider-Man quietly pivoted to being yet another multiverse project, taking place in an alternate timeline that would closely resemble the MCU, but for a few minor differences. And let me tell you, after almost 5 years of watching Marvel trip over itself and failing to make people care about its so-called multiverse saga, the thought of sitting through another multiverse project, no matter how loosely connected to the multiverse, filled me with a level of apathy I'm hard-pressed putting into words, to be honest with you. And that's without even mentioning the fact that the show looked like ass. A cel-shaded monstrosity that called to mind the worst of MTV's Spider-Man the New Animated Series, complete with stiff animation rigging. I mean, just look at this shit. Like, what the hell am I even looking at? These characters move with the rigid lifelessness of a defective Disneyland animatronic. A far cry from the dynamic visual splendor of X-Men 97. Hell, I'd even take the look of What If over this. At least the character animation in that show has some fluidity. But above all else, my disinterest in your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man was predicated on the fact that I just don't really care about the MCU Spider-Man anymore, in any form. That, and, the fact that the actor voicing Spider-Man outed himself as a problematic weirdo with an absolute loser statement on the eve of the show's premiere. But look, I'm not gonna get into that. A show is more than one person, and, to write it off based on that would be a disservice to the work that Jeff Trammell and the animators and everyone else put into making this what it is. So, really a shame that that's the thing overshadowing everything else. Marvel needs PR help desperately. Anyways, it's no secret that the MCU Spider-Man trilogy has been controversial. From the complete absence of Uncle Ben to the over-reliance on Iron Man and other connections to the wider Marvel universe, Tom Holland's Spider-Man is probably the most divisive live-action wall-crawler to date, which is saying something when the previous two iterations were both prematurely disconnected due to the overwhelmingly negative response to their final entries. I didn't care about this project when it was set in the main timeline of the MCU, and I sure as hell didn't care once it was announced that it wouldn't even be connected to the films. At best, this show would be Marvel Studios calling a mulligan for its handling of the character to this point, a second shot at the concept with little in the way of self-reflection on why the original attempt fell flat for so many people.
That is the Osborn way.
For as interconnected and self-aware as Marvel's projects tend to be, they aren't exactly what I'd call metatextual. Sure, Marvel's creative team are masters of the retcon, perpetually absorbing criticism and adjusting subsequent entries to correct for it, but the process is seldom acknowledged within the films and shows themselves. Consider, for example, Thor Ragnarok, a film that was very clearly a reaction to the negative response to Thor: The Dark World, but the film itself doesn't really have anything to say about its predecessor beyond a quick joke about Loki's quote-unquote death scene. Rather than making a film that reflects on what didn't work about its predecessor, Ragnarok is merely a reaction to the criticism Dark World received. There's no metatext, no attempt to address people's problems with the character and his films within the story, or reconcile the fact that this new film constitutes a dramatic course correction from the previous two entries. It's just presented as Thor 2.0, a cinematic equivalent of a company releasing a new improved version of their signature product. An exercise in brand management that desperately doesn't want you to focus your attention on the new product it's delivered instead of meditating on how the sausage was made or why it didn't quite taste right the last time. And for some fans, that's sufficient. Preferable even. It keeps the focus of these films fixed squarely on the in-universe story elements, but I'd argue this is a large part of why the MCU has come to feel like an assembly line pumping out empty, frivolous products as opposed to genuine works of art. Although not a requirement, good art is often incredibly metatextual. It not only draws on other texts in intentional and meaningful ways, but engages in a conversation connection with them. It has something to say about those works that goes beyond simply acknowledging their existence. MCU films are chock full of references to other works, both outside and within its canon, but they seldom have anything to actually say about those films. Outside a handful of exceptions, MCU films only ever allude to other films to establish a connection to pop culture, and they only look back at their forebears to maintain the illusion of a pre-planned interconnected universe. And even that's something they've gotten pretty bad at in recent years. Bringing it back to your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, why the hell would I want to watch a 10-episode season of television designed to reimagine the MCU Spider-Man while having nothing substantive to say about the decisions that undermined that initial attempt to adapt the character? There's no shortage of Spider-Man media out there, so why would I waste my time on one that is almost certainly going to willfully turn a blind eye to the reason it exists in the first place? I'm sure the new and improved MCU Spider-Man 2.0, now with less bugs, has some appeal for those who are only interested in these movies as plot delivery machines, but that's just not me. And yet, as you can probably guess from this video, existing, I ended up watching it in its entirety. I was sent all 10 episodes, and because, I kinda do this for a living, and I don't know, there was a morbid curiosity, I guess, deep down inside, I watched them all. I think it's important to understand where I was coming from when I sat down to watch this show, because, folks, I was dead wrong, and I couldn't have been happier to be proven wrong. Not only did I have a great time with this show, and it hooked me at the end of each and every episode, I wanted to keep watching. I mean, I binged all 10 episodes in one sitting, but it managed to engage with the problems that beset the MCU Spider-Man in ways that are both thematically and narratively compelling. It's far from perfect, and we'll get into that, but your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man is the rare example of an MCU project that treats the other entries in the franchise as legitimate artistic ventures worth engaging with critically, and actually has something to say about the creative decisions the filmmakers made, weaving an incisive metatextual critique of the John Watts Spider-Man trilogy through what has the potential to become a quintessential Spider-Man story. The premise of your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man is built around a single question. What if the MCU Spider-Man had fallen under the wing of Norman Osborn rather than Tony Stark? In lesser hands, it'd be little more than a what-if episode. A fun, if trivial, little thought experiment that muses the extent to which our morality is shaped by our environment, placing us in an alternate universe where Peter Parker is mentored by his arch-nemesis rather than the world's foremost Avenger to see if and how that change would alter the trajectory of his life. It would be undoubtedly interesting, probably more interesting than the vast majority of scenarios explored in What If, but it would likely fall short of saying anything interesting about the MCU's take on Spider-Man beyond, thank God 616 Peter was mentored by a hero rather than a villain, because that sure would have been bad. Even if you made the story about Peter remaining true to his moral core and ultimately defying Osborn, the show would say virtually nothing about the Spider-Man films we actually got. Thankfully, showrunner Jeff Trammell isn't lesser hands and wisely uses this premise as a means to interrogate the decision to give Peter, a traditionally working-class hero, a billionaire mentor at all, something that has been a persistent criticism of Tom Holland's Spider-Man from his very first appearance in Captain America: Civil War, where he's depicted as a gullible kid who blindly trusts Tony Stark enough to fight at his side against Captain America in a conflict he doesn't fully understand. In its opening minutes, your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man telegraphs the fact it will be concerned with the MCU Spider-Man's uncomfortably cozy relationship with the elites by destroying a prominent symbol of that relationship, Midtown High, the state-of-the-art STEM high school Peter attends across the Watts trilogy. As a result of the damage done, Peter and his new friend Nico are forced to attend Rockford T. Bales High School, a decidedly more conventional high school that explicitly doesn't offer the same advanced science courses that Peter would have taken at Midtown. So, a typical American public school. Right from the jump, we're forced to consider the way in which the MCU Spider-Man was all but stripped of the working-class signifiers that comprise his world in other media, by presenting us with a Peter who almost attends the elite STEM prep school before being yanked back into the underfunded education system that most people in Peter's socioeconomic situation experience. The show subtly highlights just how weird it is that the MCU Spider-Man goes to a school like Midtown in the first place. It effectively takes a popular criticism of the MCU Spider-Man and makes it a part of the text of the show. This happens again at the end of the episode when Peter returns home from an afternoon of crime fighting to find Norman Osborn in his Aunt May's apartment. This moment is an almost beat-for-beat, shot-for-shot remake of Spider-Man's first scene in the MCU, with the only difference being that it's Norman Osborn waiting for Peter in his living room, not Tony Stark. While this moment certainly packs a punch for all the surface-level reasons I already went over, oh my god, it's the bad guy instead of the good guy. The deliberate way this moment mirrors the scene in Civil War plants the seed for a much more subversive idea. What if there really isn't a difference between Tony Stark taking Peter under his wing and Norman Osborn taking Peter under his wing? What if, and stay with me here folks, what if Peter being mentored by a billionaire is a bad idea, regardless of who that billionaire is? It's a provocative thought, and again, one that echoes the sentiments of many fans who have criticized the way in which the MCU Spider-Man's life revolves around his billionaire mentor without so much as a suggestion that maybe it's a bad thing. For the purposes of the show, the only real difference between Osborn and Stark is that because we know who he becomes, Osborn's involvement is more self-evidently nefarious for the average viewer, and because of that, the show is allowed to more overtly level criticism against his role as Spider-Man's mentor than the Watts films were able to with Stark, who, despite not necessarily being depicted as a good mentor, had to ultimately be shown as having Peter's best interests at heart, lest the audience stop viewing him as a hero altogether. Put another way, swapping Stark for Osborn allows the show to more clearly make the case that giving Spidey a billionaire mentor is a bad idea that fundamentally betrays the very core of what this character has traditionally represented. The show expands on this idea further a couple of episodes later when Norman discovers Peter's secret identity and offers to extend Oscorp's vast resources to Spider-Man. Peter's far more resistant to Osborn's offer than he was Stark's, in part because we've seen him grappling with legitimate criticisms of Osborn and the brand of hyper-capitalism he embodies in his interactions with characters like Nico, but despite this hesitation, he ultimately accepts Norman's offer anyway, presumably because he doesn't want to piss off the most powerful man in the city who now happens to know his secret identity. And it doesn't take long for this power imbalance to manifest more explicitly. Although he's clearly grateful for the assistance, Peter pretty quickly becomes cognizant of the various ways in which working with Norman is restricting his autonomy. Partnering with Norman has essentially robbed him of the ability to be his own man. And rather than framing these newfound restrictions as being the result of Norman's well-intentioned paternalism, a perspective Homecoming embraces in order to preserve a modicum of the audience's sympathy for Tony Stark, your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man exposes them for what they are, one half of a transaction. Spider-Man effectively becomes an employee of Oscorp, one who uses his powers within the purview of Oscorp's interest in exchange for compensation, which in this case is access to the company's tech. Detractors of the MCU Spider-Man films often derisively refer to Holland's Spider-Man as Iron Boy Jr. to highlight the fact that the character feels more like Iron Man's sidekick than a hero in his own right. And that's effectively what Spider-Man becomes to Norman, the amazing Oscorp man. Or should I say,
Little Goblin Jr.
While the Watts films leave some room to defend Spider-Man from accusations of selling out, here, it's undeniable. Coerced or not, Peter has unequivocally sold out. The only thing missing are the logos on his suit. And again, this isn't so much a case of, wow, Norman is a way worse mentor than Tony, as it is a case of, wow, it's so much clearer how fucked up this dynamic is once you swap out the name of the billionaire who effectively owns Peter. Throughout the season, we see Norman attempt to remake Spider-Man in his own image. Beyond the way this reflects Tony Stark's outsized influence over Peter in the MCU, it can also be read as a broader critique of the inherent tension between artist and patron. Norman funds Spider-Man, and so he therefore believes he has as much of a claim to the idea as Peter. In his eyes, his financial investment entitles him to a degree of control, even if he doesn't fully understand the thing he's trying to control. This is definitely something that comes into play later on in the season, but for the sake of spoilers, I'm not going to touch on it too much. But in the third episode, Norman uses data obtained through focus groups to overhaul everything from Spider-Man's suit to his name and his main method of traversal. He doesn't have any ideas for what Spider-Man ought to be, he just knows he wants to change it. More insidiously, he also begins to dictate what Spider-Man does. After all, it's his tech, so shouldn't he get to set the agenda? And as a result, Spider-Man goes from taking on local crime to getting involved in a much bigger conspiracy, one that he doesn't fully understand is predicated on Osborn's personal feud with a former partner. That sure does sound familiar, doesn't it? Before Peter even realizes it, he's become Norman's private enforcer, one who has to abandon social commitments to go protect Oscorp assets. Another eerily familiar beat. Despite all this, a big part of your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man's genius is its refusal to let Norman go full heel. Sure, his priorities are warped and he's clearly taking advantage of having a superhero in his back pocket, but he never strays into full megalomania. I'm sure that's coming down the line, but as of season 1, the Norman we get is just as plausibly well-intentioned as someone like Tony Stark. Yet, because he is Norman Osborn and not Iron Man, we intuitively know we can't trust him, and therein lies the ultimate point. In using Norman instead of Tony, but keeping him on the level, it becomes clear that Spider-Man has no business working for the rich and powerful. It doesn't matter how generous the billionaire is or how ostensibly on the same side they are, their interests are fundamentally at odds and only serve to pervert what Spider-Man represents. In short, this show makes the case that the MCU should never have gone down that route with this character to begin with. This point is made more succinctly, though, through Lonnie Lincoln, Bale High's star quarterback, and the man destined to become the concrete-skinned bruiser, Tombstone. Throughout the season, Peter's story is directly contrasted with Lonnie's fall into a life of crime. Despite his academic and athletic promise, Lonnie gets caught up in a local gang trying to protect his delinquent brother, and it begins wreaking havoc on his personal life. Among other things, he gets dropped from the football team, starts keeping his family at a distance, and pushes away his loving girlfriend. In a way, Lonnie's story and his struggle to maintain a dual identity more closely resembles the prototypical Spider-Man story than either MCU Spider-Man stories do. But beyond crystallizing how bizarre of a choice it was to approach the MCU Spider-Man this way, by contrasting this version of Spider-Man with a more conventionally Spider-Man-esque origin story, Lonnie also serves as a reminder of the people Spider-Man isn't helping while he's caught up doing Norman's bidding. Had Peter remained a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, one can assume he might have been able to help Lonnie before it was too late. Instead of fighting to defend Oscorp's market cap, he could have been taking on the kinds of low-level gangsters who are blackmailing Lonnie. In a very literal sense, Lonnie demonstrates how Peter's alliance with Osborn comes at the expense of the community he started out trying to protect. In no uncertain terms, this is a Spider-Man who is letting down his own people for the sake of a man who only cares about people like Peter and Lonnie when they're useful to him. He's your friendly neighborhood class traitor. Here's the thing. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man is the greatest Spider-Man show ever made, not when both the 90s Spider-Man series and the Spectacular Spider-Man already exist. The art style, while surprisingly appealing when it's still reminiscent of Steve Ditko comic panels, is a genuine eyesore in motion and does the stillness a major disservice, and although I appreciate where the show ultimately goes, it does take a bit too long to get rolling. However, despite these shortcomings, I can safely say I walked away a fan of this show. For the first time, maybe ever, Marvel Studios seems to have a vision for Spider-Man, and that vision is built on a keen understanding of what didn't work in their first attempt. An understanding Jeff Trammell and his team have demonstrated with confidence, clarity, and purpose. If you're someone who watched those first few episodes and wrote the entire show off as just another mediocre Marvel project, I can't really blame you. They are the weakest episodes of the show. It doesn't make the best first impression. But believe me when I say there comes a point where this show hits its stride, and when it does, oh boy, does it deliver. It even incorporates some of the aspects of the Spider-Man PlayStation games. I really don't have to tell you that Marvel has been in a bit of a creative rut as of late, but Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man feels like a legitimate step forward for the studio's approach to storytelling. X-Men 97 proved that there was still gas in the MCU's tank, that they were still capable of producing bangers if they got the right people and gave them room to cook. And now, your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man has shown that Marvel is willing to reflect on their failures and use them as a catalyst for better storytelling, rather than trying to make incremental changes in the margins. I've said it once, and I'll say it again, Marvel Animation is leading the way for Marvel Studios right now, and we just have to hope that the film division is paying close attention.